Hi, everyone. Welcome back to World Creativity and Innovation Week. This is one of your moderators, Andrew Weiss. We are so excited to be here with Sharon. And before we get started, first, I want to give a huge shout out to our sponsors. Thank you so much to Haggerty Digital and My Favorite Art Place for making this event a reality. We're all very excited to be here and hear the wonderful information. Up next, for our next presentation, we have Sharon here, Sharon Hillestad. And Sharon was a classroom teacher in the 60s, a homeschool leader in the 70s and 80s, and has been an educational consultant for the past 20 years. She's the author of a just released book on Amazon titled The Reading War, and she is here to talk about the right way to teach reading. Ladies and gentlemen, Sharon Hillestad, go ahead and take it away.
All right, let's see if I can figure it out. I press share. Holly, okay. All right. Now the right way to teach PowerPoint is perhaps a lesson I should have had.
And then click the present button.
Yeah, where's the present button? Here's the view. The view.
Yeah, you click view too, and then present.
And then present. There we go.
There you go.
Okay. So teaching reading the right way. Now that has been the subject of a great debate that has been going on for nearly 100 years. A debate about what is the right way to teach reading. But unfortunately, a lot of teachers didn't even know there was a debate. They just thought the way they were taught how to teach reading in college was the right way. Well, I'm making this presentation around a term called functional illiteracy, or the functional illiterate. This is a new term. Illiterate means a person who cannot read at all. But a functional illiterate is a person who has been to school, maybe 10 or 12 years, because it's the law nowadays, and cannot read well. Cannot read well enough just to function in daily life. Fill out job applications, read directions, that type of thing. I wanted to tell you about a well-known functional illiterate named John Corcoran. John Corcoran started school about the same year I did, 1950. John Corcoran was taught how to read in the same way I was taught how to read, except John Corcoran didn't learn. He didn't learn in first grade, second grade, third grade. He didn't learn in 8th grades. But he was passed along and he went into high school. You can see his high school picture there. He was a real popular guy. He was a jock, had tons of friends, and those friends got him through high school. They did his papers, took his tests, graduated from high school. Now, because John Corcoran was such a gifted athlete, he was given a scholarship to college, and he took it. Joined a fraternity. His fraternity brothers helped him get through college. He says he got through college with aggressive cheating. But at age 45, but the story doesn't really end there, because after college, he got a job teaching school. So John Corcoran taught school for 17 years, not being able to read past a second grade level. His wife did his paperwork. His students did the roll call. He did lots of movies. He was able to get by. But at age 45, he was a little fed up with not knowing how to read. He had been fed up for 40 years, actually. And at age 45, he discovered that he wasn't the only adult that didn't know how to read. In fact, there were so many adults in this country that didn't know how to read that nearly every state has a literacy coalition or a literacy foundation, or do free literacy teaching in their libraries. And so he went down to the library, and a volunteer sat down and showed him some of the things about the English language that he missed in first grade. And he started to learn to read. So he took care of some of his problems there, and then he continued. He got more expert teachers, He said it took him 7 years to bring his literacy level up to where he wanted it to be, where he could read any book he wanted to. So John Corcoran wrote a book. It's called The Teacher Who Couldn't Read. And this book is available on Amazon. You can check him out, Google him, and read his story. And if he was the only one, he would be quite an anomaly, but he's not the only one. It is suggested that there are perhaps more than 100 million such people. People who've been to school 10 or 12 years, because it's the law, and they can't read well enough to function in life. And I've met a few of these people. They come to the literacy center that I worked at for 20 years. One of them was Shayla. She was a Black woman. She's 22 years old. She called up. She just was demanding that someone help her. She says, I can't read the words on my own driver's license. She was a very smart girl, but she quit school at 11th grade because what's the point? You can't read any of the lessons. And I was able to teach Shayla how to read in less than 6 months because I knew what she was missing. She didn't know what to do with the vowels. And once she learned that, and she learned how to syllabize, make words into syllables, she could read big words. And she called me up at Christmas and she said, Sharon, I just read the word ornaments. Dang, I didn't think I could ever do that. Shayla wasn't the only adult illiterate I worked with either. Now, we didn't start out that way. At the end of the Revolutionary War, when the country was getting set up, our founding fathers knew that we need to educate the people. If we wanted to keep a free country, we have to have educated people. And one of the lesser known founding fathers was Noah Webster. And Noah Webster had a fantastic drive to do something about the education of American children. He did not like the fact that in the schools that they had, they were using books from Britain. So he started writing textbooks. And he started writing the American dictionary, the American English Dictionary, which happened to be the first English dictionary ever written, ever compiled. Oxford Dictionary from England came into being after Webster's. So Noah Webster is known as the father of American scholarship. And his huge contribution was to write a very small book known as the Blueback Speller, which taught children or adults how to read. I just put up the first page to show you how intense this program was and how much information there was on every single page. You know, there wasn't a lot of paper in those days, so they made use of what they had. But the way he taught reading was by spelling. So they would learn how to spell the word boom, write the word boom, and then they would know how to read the word boom. Of course, the children were working on slates. There weren't workbooks and so forth for them. And these schools were called blab schools because the teachers would give everything orally and the children would write it on the slates. They would repeat it back. But the children that went to school learned to read. If they didn't go to school, they probably didn't learn to read. During this period of time, teacher wrote a series of books called the McGuffey Readers. And these books gave the children something to read. They were very heavy in excerpts from literature, speeches, poems, and a lot of moral teaching, and not overly religious, but definitely moralistic. So this is what the schools kind of look like. There are lots of rural schools, one-room schools, children being taught with their brothers and their sisters, being taught by a teacher who might have had a few months training, or maybe a year, or maybe none. She just happened to have more patience or able to keep the discipline. And she knew how to read. And she would use these materials and teach the children. Compulsory education came into being in 1930. Now, there was plenty of education going on before then. Lots of churches were educating, had schools, and even people who couldn't afford to pay the fees were often granted into the schools. They were just, the education was promoted. Of course, the slaves didn't get taught because, you know what, if you teach someone how to read, they start getting ideas. And so that was neglected. But a very famous slave, Frederick Douglass, somehow he obtained a blueback speller, and he got help from the white boys. And he learned to read from that speller. And he became very famous and very educated. Around this time, John Dewey came on the scene. Now, John Dewey was the father of compulsory public school. He wanted people to have to go to school. And I recently read that one of the purposes that the compulsory public school came into being was to do something about all those Catholic schools that were being set up by the Catholic immigrants who were setting up their own schools. And so the purpose of public education in the first place was to eliminate private schools and get everybody learning the same stuff at the same time and being taught by teachers who were being trained in the same way. Now, John Dewey did not develop the Dewey Decimal System. He gets the credit, but that was developed by Melvin Dewey, who brought some order into libraries. John Dewey was a teacher and a psychologist, and he taught for 3 years in a classroom where he was actually teaching children. Then he decided he'd rather teach teachers. So he went to one of the big teachers' colleges and became a professor, and he moved right up the ranks. And for over 30 years, he trained teachers who then became professors in other teachers' colleges. So his philosophy was taught to people who then went and taught it to other people. Well, not everybody agreed with John Dewey, because one of John Dewey's things was that we're spending way too much time teaching children how to read. We shouldn't be spending 2 years teaching children how to read. Well, there was another educator, very famous, only she was in Italy, Maria Montesorri. And of course, she had a whole different philosophy. Maria Montesorri was a medical doctor, didn't know anything about psychology, but she did know about children. She could observe children. She could tell when they were ready to learn. And then she'd feed them a lot of stuff. And she could tell when they had no reach at all. So then she wouldn't bother them. And she took out the barriers that would block children from learning with her materials. So in 1912, Maria Montesorri was invited to come to this country by some educators who wanted her materials in our public schools. But there were enough professors already steeped in the Dewey philosophy to prevent this Montessori from having the influence that she should have had. And the teachers that she did train could not get a job in a public school. So there were Montessori schools set up privately, and they had some effect, but nowhere near the effect they would have had if we could have gotten Montessori schools in our public schools at the beginning. Now, there was a debate going on, and this debate was going on in the 20s. Phonics versus whole word. Phonics was the traditional way, had been the way reading had been taught since the English language had been written down, because it's these symbols stand for sounds. Drilling had always been used, and now drilling was going out of style. It was just too boring, but memorizing words was coming into style. Teachers often continued to teach phonics even when the professors were teaching them not to teach phonics. But there were whole school systems that threw out the phonic way of teaching and muzzled their phonic teachers. And so there were already children going through first grade, not learning how to read, going through second grade, still not learning how to read. Some of these parents of these children brought these kids to Dr. Orton. Dr. Orton was a brain doctor. Now, this is real early in brain research, but they actually knew quite a lot about it. And so these children were brought to him, and he looks at them, and they're totally normal kids, and he can't find anything wrong with their brains, but they had a different learning style. And so he was looking at how they were being taught how to read. Every single child that was brought to him with a reading disability were being taught to read by whole word, the sight word method, where you'd memorize a word, not learn what makes that word say that sound. So he hooked up with a very gifted teacher, Gillingham was her name, and they set about curing those children. And every kid that had a reading disability, when they went through a program of learning how the sounds, what sounds the letters make, and how they work in words, they were all cured of their learning disability. And he wrote this up. And I actually have a copy of a paper that he wrote in the 20s in a psychology magazine, saying the new way of teaching reading is not good for a huge number of children. And so he wasn't able to stop what was coming down the pike, which was the sight word method of teaching reading. So he developed an organization that would train teachers. Oh, and by the way, he is the first person to use the word dyslexia. He coined that term. Now, this is what I'm talking about when I'm saying phonics. There are 44 sounds in the English language. Only 44 sounds. We can say all of this stuff, but we're only making 44 different sounds. And these are the symbols that stand for those sounds. Now, phonics teachers would often drill these symbols, and of course, some cases it might have gotten over-drilled. You know, some children probably didn't need that, but there definitely were kids that did need it, and they didn't get it. Along about this time, there was another man on the scene, Leonard Bloomfield. Now, he also was not a psychologist, he was a linguist. And a linguist is a person who studies languages. Now, Leonard Bloomfield, he knew everything about words, and he was very interested in the structure of words. So when he had a child that wasn't learning to read, he set about making word lists for him. He made 70 such word lists. And the first word list is, I have on the line here, cat, bat, rat, fat. The second word list, guess what? And words, can, ran, fan, pan. The next one, add words. And, you know, you have 100 words that the child would be able to read, one vowel sound only, ah. There were 70 such lists, and his child studied the words organized that way. And in Bloomfield's own words, the child learned to read like a walk in the park. It was so easy. So he passed this list on to a friend of his, Clarence Barnhart. Now, Clarence Barnhart had been his student at Yale in a linguistics class. And now Clarence Barnhart was, of all things, writing dictionaries, And so Clarence Barnhart used that program that Leonard Bloomfield had created, the 70-word list, and he taught his own son, Robert. And Robert Barnhart is still writing dictionaries to this day, but he learned to read this way. Now, Barnhart and Bloomfield had such success with this that they gave this program to a group in New York called a literary society. And these were very educated people, and they used these word lists to teach their own children to read. And that was the first broad use of the list. Well, they figured, you know what, the teachers ought to know this, because the teachers don't know just how simple it could be to teach reading if we just, cut it back and made it easier by having them have repetitive sounds until they learned all the short vowel sounds. For instance, short vowel sounds, for instance, the I, those short sounds of the vowels are in more than 60% of the words and syllables. So just knowing the short vowel sounds and knowing the consonants would allow a child to be able to read and spell over 1,500 words, not even getting into any other vowel sounds. You think that doesn't give them some confidence? Well, anyway, Leonard Bloomfield and Barnhart tried desperately for 8 or 12 years to get this into the schools. They went to curriculum companies, they went to colleges where they were doing all kinds of experimentation, but they wouldn't experiment on this. But finally, there was a school that picked it up, and it was a Catholic school in Chicago. And they gave these nuns 70 lists of words. Well, they didn't have little books, they didn't have worksheets. They had 70 lists of words, and they were trained how to teach it. Interestingly enough, they also taught reading by spelling. And the child would have to know the names of all the letters before he even got time to see the words. Anyway, these nuns were taught the linguistics way of teaching reading, which was by spelling. So that took care of the left to right thing, because you're going to start on this side and spell left to right. So there weren't any dyslexics being created by looking at a word and maybe looking at it backwards. And this was such a successful venture that 1,068 children, Polish immigrant kids, and this is in 1942 in Chicago, were taught how to read, every single child. Some of them learned how to read incredibly well. Now that program is still available, and I actually promote this pretty heavily because anybody who knows how to read could then teach someone else how to read. They don't have to know all the sounds, the phonetic sounds, because they're going to learn it within words. It's not taught separately, but within words. And when a child, so this is like a replacement for the blueback speller, Noah Webster did it right way back in the 1800s, and the Bloomfield Barnhart program is doing it right. And there's actually many excellent phonic programs as well. This one I promote because so many parents do not know OI says oi. They don't know that. But if they have this program, they don't need to know that separately. They can learn it along with the kid. So this is just an example of what the inside of the book might look like. This is lesson 91. Now, everything, they do have some reading sentences and paragraphs there for them. And there's not a single word in those sentences that the child couldn't figure out because he's been taught these various components, what makes these sounds earlier. Well, this was a very successful program. So the Barnharts and the Let's Read folks invited Dr. Gray to come and look at it. See these kids. They had 1,000 children who could read English in 2nd grade. They were very good readers. And Dr. Gray was the top reading guru at the time. He was the authority. He was the one that everybody was going to. Also, Dr. Gray at that time happened to be working on a series of readers called Dick and Jane. Now, he did see children reading well, but he decided that they were just making those kids into word callers. He particularly got upset when he saw a 2nd grader read a newspaper article. Now, Cynthia Barnhart told me this story directly. She said, we made a mistake. We handed a child a newspaper and he picked out an article on relativity and he read it word perfectly. But of course, he didn't understand a thing. Well, I mean, there's dictionaries now. We can start clearing words on them, right? But that's not the way Dr. Gray saw it. Dr. Gray said, you're making them into word callers. You have to read for meaning. Okay, so he successfully suppressed the program. It did not get taught in teachers' colleges. And in fact, if it ever came up in teachers' colleges, it was with disdain. He was an advocate of the sight method of teaching reading, and his books had sentences like this. And these words, the reason there was so much repetition is that the child had to learn the word by seeing it often. So we had lots of looks. But the child didn't know why the word said look. So he couldn't read the word book just because he could read the word look, to say nothing of shook. Well, Dick and Jane became a best-selling set of books. Actually, I learned to read from Dick and Jane. I was pretty enthralled with the books, very colorful pictures. That's actually what made them work, is the illustrations. They spent tons of money on illustrations. And the program is credited with teaching millions of children to read. And I take issue with that, because when these books were first came out after the war, they did just spread out all over the schools from one end of the country to the other, had Dick and Jane. They had never been piloted by teachers, and teachers never got a chance to vote whether or not they wanted this series or a different series. They just got them. And then they were told to quit teaching phonics. But lots of teachers kept doing it anyway. I've talked to them. I've talked to teachers from that period of time. And they taught phonics in secret. And I remember my own teacher erasing a board that had phonics lessons on it when she saw that the superintendent had driven into the yard. I was educated in a little public school, so the superintendent was miles away, thank God. But when she drove in, that teacher erased that board because she was doing something she had been directed not to do, which was teaching a little bit of phonics. Now, she had to teach phonics around teaching Dick and Jane. So she also was teaching the word fun, the word Dick, the word Jane, the word and. Just look how many different vowel sounds are just in the title itself. Well, we're going to leave Dick and Jane, and we'll go to Darryl and Sharon. That's myself and my younger brother, who's younger by only 11 months. So we were in the same school. I started school a year ahead of him, and he flunked first grade. And my mother told me that they just they didn't understand why Darryl flunked first grade. He was the smart one of the two. She did say I was the cute one, but he was the smarter. He was more brilliant of the two of us. And he flunked first grade. Well, you know what? He wasn't the only kid to flunk first grade. He wasn't the only smart kid not to make it through first grade learning how to read. I, being a girl and wanting to read and willing to put up with anything, even though I thought it was hard. I thought it was learning to read was hard. I did learn to read. Well, there were enough kids that did not learn to read that Rudolf Flesch, who was a college professor, wrote a book about it. This came about because he was asked to tutor a boy who was in 6th grade and was about to flunk 6th grade because he couldn't read. So he sits down, he starts tutoring this boy, and I think this boy was his own grandson. And he discovered that the child did not know how to sound out words. And as soon as he learned what made up words, as soon as he learned the code and how to blend words, well, he was off and running. And he could pass 6th grade. But that led Rudolf Flesch to do some investigation. And so he checked out some of the other children in his neighborhood. Found out they didn't know how to sound out words. He went and talked to the teachers, found out they didn't know how to teach phonics. Went to the curriculum companies, found out they weren't making any curriculum to teach phonics. So he wrote the book, Why Johnny Can't Read. This book came out in 1955. And it was a bestseller. And teachers all over the country were writing to the author, writing to the publisher, and saying, yes, they know that. They agreed. Children aren't learning to read because they're not being taught to read. And the new teachers coming into school haven't a clue on how to teach how to read. And they're just following the teacher's guides with the Dick and Jane readers or the other sight word readers, because there were like 3 other companies too. And there were always 3 reading groups. So the kids that got it real easily, middle group, and then the bottom group. And unfortunately, you get in the bottom group, you kind of stay in the bottom group. Now, the book became a bestseller. Teachers not only wrote to the publisher, but they organized. So there was a number of teachers that organized, and by 1963, they became the Reading Reform Foundation. Now, I didn't find them till 1980 because I didn't read Why Johnny Can't Read till 1980. Although I had heard about it when I was 10 years old, and I had asked a college professor about it when I'm sitting in a class, learning techniques on education. And I mentioned, well, what about the Why Johnny Can't Read book? And he just practically had a heart attack right there and just demeaned the book, demeaned Rudolf Flesch. Well, it was enough. I didn't read it. Well, I didn't read it until I got my own little Johnnies. Then I thought, well, maybe I should look at this book. Okay, these are sight words. If a child has to memorize sight words, and right now, these are the sight words that's being taught to children in school. If we just take the first dozen that the kindergartner is supposed to memorize, you can see that the letter A, it has the A sound in a couple words, the sound when it's a single. It has no sound at all in the word said. And the letter I can sound, well, in all of these, it happens to all sound short, so that would be good. And then look at what happens to O. There's no way that the child can develop a system of reading because it's not taught systematically. It's taught haphazardly. Now, these sight words are taught in, the definition of sight word, I need to tell you that changed. My earliest definition of sight word was when a word could not be sounded out. like the word said, AI doesn't say A like it's supposed to. Like the word who, like the word I, E-Y-E. They cannot be sounded out. Those are sight words. Well, by the time, I don't know when this started, 20 or 30 years ago or less, but the sight words were changed. The definition of sight words was changed to words that you recognize automatically. And so the kid is supposed to recognize these words automatically. And if he knows these words, that'll help him guess at the words that he doesn't know. So there is a reading war. And it has been going on since the 20s. Actually, it was going on even further than that. I have read about research that was done in 1912. They could actually take pictures of people reading, children reading, and those who had been taught to read by sight words read slower, even if they did learn to read. Okay, they would have pictures. They might see the word house, but say horse. And then they get up, they read along. Oh, they got to back up. No, that's not house, it's horse, or it's not horse's house. And so they were jerky readers and it slowed them down. But the children who had been taught phonetically just to go left to right on a word and know what it said were much faster readers. Well, if you can read fast, you're likely to read more. So even the ones that learned how to read probably didn't read as much. Okay, the alphabetic code, spelling rules, there's 30 spelling rules. Now the alphabetic code, there's 70 symbols that stand for our 44 sounds. Yeah, we do not have a simple language, written language. And it's interesting, recently I just read, because of course now there's so much functionally illiterate, so many illiterate people that have been in school for years. And guess what? The authorities are blaming it on the language. We got a confusing language. It came from Greek and from Latin, and then the French got involved and messed it up even more. And so that's why we have all these spelling patterns. And so it's the language fault that these people don't know how to read. Well, that's going to take something to fix, don't you think? Now, for me, what is the problem is how it was taught. Because, okay, so it's a complex code. So let's teach it simply. We can use the phonic method. We can use the linguistics method. But you use the sight word method, and you've got a problem. It's been a very long war. I've just included a few people and the main ones who've been involved in this. The traditional instruction was changed. Okay, John Dewy, William Gray are our biggest promoters on that. And we end up with functionally illiterate adults. Now, it's not like we maybe should have had something else when we probably should have, but it could have been improved. We could have used the Montessori method. Here's some statistics. In the dark blue, these are by the millions of people. 8.2 million people could not even participate in this test because they couldn't read well enough. 8.4 million are below level 1 of reading, and 26.5 million are at level 1, which is still not good enough. That these are all your functionally illiterates. Okay, then we get into the mid and high English literacy, and we have a few million there, but only 26 million who are at the top. So what do we have to handle that? Well, we've got literacy centers. This is a picture of the center I worked in for a long time. And we were teaching children the alphabet. This is why wait until they're adults. And we're employing teenagers to help us teach the kids the alphabet. and the alphabetic sounds, and they were learning it at the same time. Here's a picture of a couple of my little Johnnies. This is when I started homeschooling, because having been inside the classroom, I knew that there were a certain number, you always had a low group. And looking at my boys, I thought, man, one or both of them could end up in the low group. Well, if I'm going to have to teach them how to read, I might as well teach them to read correctly, teach them to read right in the first place, rather than just redo it in the second place. This is something I would have my children when I was teaching school know. Our mind and our thoughts determine our doingness, determine what we believe. It determines how we can live. So your mind is a garden and your thoughts are the seeds. So why would we tell a child that he's a reading disabled child, that he's ADHD, that he's stupid? When it's not the child that's stupid. It's the program that's stupid. It's the training of the teachers that's stupid. And we can do something about it in a big way, or each family can just do something about it for themselves, because that's pretty much what's going on now. We have this wide group of homeschoolers. When I was homeschooling in the 70s, believe me, I was the only family in the town homeschooling. That's not true anymore. There's plenty of families homeschooling in my original town, and it's growing. Private schools are picking up and teaching children the right way. But every child should be taught the right way. And if we have some influence, maybe we should just get this into the schools. Every child is a beautiful child. They're smart. They need to know how to do this, and we need to teach them. So I'm a person who does what I can do about something, and I've written a book called The Reading War, and it's now available on Amazon as of last night. And if you would like more information, or if you think you got enough, please check this out. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm done.
All right, Sharon, thank you. That was wonderful hearing about the history and things doing to combat it, and the war that's going on. I'm definitely excited for those tuning in to definitely get a copy of Sharon's book. We're excited to hear about that. Some of the questions that we wanted to make sure you get a chance to answer. One of them came in that said, what is it about teaching phonics to the preschoolers that helps them in school later? Can you expand on that again?
Okay, well, actually, it should be very carefully done, because not every little preschooler is ready to learn to read. You know, there's the brain development may not be there. And if they're taught too early, they're just going to be too confused. So a preschool teacher needs to be aware of which children are ready, and then go for it and teach them the sounds of the letters. Teach them the short vowel sounds, or just start with one, like the short A sound, and you can teach hundreds of words. But don't try to teach a child that's not ready, because you'll just confuse them.
Yeah, makes sense. And for those tuning in, feel free to ask any questions you have. We'd love to hear from you to make sure you get a chance to get Sharon's expertise while she's here with us today. And looks like another question came in. What are some things you can look for to see if a child is ready?
Oh, well, they're reaching. They want to read books. And in my case, I remember sitting on the steps with my cousin Garland, who was a year older than I, and him showing me his Dick and Jane book and teaching me the word look and teaching me the word. He taught me before I even started school. Well, now my brother Darryl, he was nowhere near doing that kind of thing. You know, he's out climbing trees and pitching rocks at the cars just going by and doing, you know, interesting things. So not everybody's ready, but if they're reaching, if for sure, you know you've gone too far and too much if you've got a child crying in school. I've heard too many instances of kindergarten children putting their head down on their desk and just crying because they are so confused. Now that's a crime because you're actually creating a disabled student right there. No, you're whatever that child begins to think, he's going to manifest. So if that child thinks, I can't learn to read, no, and he looks around, he sees that other people are learning to read, but I can't learn to read. Well, there's your decision, and there's your learning block. And that's the decision we have to get rid of when we are teaching adults. And I have taught a lot of adults, and for them to just start to be aware of their own smartness is pretty interesting. And then they get mad. Why wasn't I shown this when I was in first grade? In fact, I had that with Shayla. After I taught her how to read, she, a few years later, brought in her two little girls, one in kindergarten, one in first grade. And they did know their short vowel sounds. They had been taught this in school, and they were reading cat and red and fit and stop, and they knew their short vowel sounds. And Shayla looked at me and she said, Sharon, I didn't know that when I was their age, did I? And that was right. Shayla didn't know her short vowel sounds when she was in first grade. She had to be 22 years old, find a tutor who could teach her. So it can be a pretty desperate thing for these people. And my idea is, let's fix it. Let's fix it in a big way. If not in a big way, well, then I'll just help each family fix it themselves.
Yeah, thank you. That's definitely good to know. And more questions coming in. Looks like a lot of people are excited to ask you a lot of things about this topic. Another question that came in is, why is it better to teach phonics first rather than phonics in the whole language and sight words at the same time?
Well, what you learn first is what you're going to do. Guess how long it took me to be willing to text anybody? It was 2 years. I had a cell phone and I did not text, because if somebody wants to tell me anything, they should just call me and I'll call them, right? Because that's the first thing I knew. Same thing with children. If they learned and they're drilled to guess at words from their first letter and their second letter, not first and second, no, the first letter and the last letter. That's the cue. That's one of the cues. It's like, well, look at the first letter and look at the last letter and just kind of mush in the vowels, because the vowels are the hardest thing to teach. So that's why they're taught separately. You get one vowel sound, you get a lot of words with that vowel pattern, and then we go to the next one. We don't give them all at the same time. And so children learn to read, and they have a pattern to read. And so then you have to break that pattern and say, no, don't guess at the word, sound it out. I have a granddaughter who's still guessing at words. She's one of your stubborn kind, and that's the way she was taught how to read. She lives in a different state. I wasn't able to teach her. And she still will guess before she'll sound out. Now, eventually, she'll probably have a necessity to do it right, because it's there for her. Her brother, who got the phonics training right from the beginning, sounds out every word. It's not just sounding out the words, but it's the syllables. So there are patterns in the syllables. I'll tell you a story about a boy that we had at the Learning Center who was on a computer phonics program. And he learned all the sounds. He was a 6th or 7th grader. I think he was 7th grader. And he didn't know any phonics, but he got in this computerized program that we had. And he not only learned the sounds, and OI says OI, ER says and how to blend words by syllables, but how to separate words by syllables. separate syllables in words. Anyway, just check him out one day. I put up the word cucumber, and he could not read that word to me until we separated it out. C-U-C-U-M-B-E-R. And he knew that if a vowel comes at the end of a syllable, you sound it long. So he went cucumber. Oh, he says, oh, if you did that, you could read anything. Do you know that was the last time we saw him? Because now he knew totally. He knew what to do when he got to a big word, divide in syllables, and he could read anything. But he did know the code by then. So yeah, the first thing that they learned was going to be the strongest thing to stay with them. And if we have to remediate them, then we're breaking a habit. And with some, it's hard to break, and with others, not so hard. But that's the way it goes.
All right. No, it's definitely, I love that story of the cucumber. It's always good to hear that kind of excitement in people's voices. And another question that came in is, can you explain more about the research that validates that Phonics First is the most effective for the most students?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's like, I don't know if I can get the year correct, but it's since 2000. There's been so much research. There was so much research on comparing these two programs, Phonics First. No, we say Phonics First. All right. Teach them how to sound out words before you teach them sight words. That proved so much more effective. And there's plenty of scientific literature on that. In fact, there are now teachers teaching teachers about this. And there's something called the Reading League, which is a group of teachers who are classroom teachers. Some of them had been classroom teachers for years, and they come across this whole phonics thing, and they start using it, and it starts improving their product, and so they get to be real experts in this. And so they're going to have a seminar or a big conference in North Carolina this month. It's called the Reading League. Anyone who wants to get to be a professional in this, I would recommend that group of teachers. One of the teachers that I saw YouTube on got involved because she was tutoring her own child using the methods that she had learned in teachers college, and found it wasn't working, even on a one-to-one. She thought it might not be working when she had a whole classroom because she wasn't able to do one-on-one, but here she had one-to-one with her own child, and just telling them to try harder or guess from context just wasn't working. Anyway, she became one of the leaders in this Reading League. And so I'm very happy to see a group do that. And they're right where they belong. They're teaching teachers, and it's the teachers. It's the teachers that change the country. You change the teachers and you change the country. And I'll leave you with that.
All right. Thank you, Sharon. Well, we are coming to the top of the hour, but we do have one last question before we let you have some closing thoughts. Can you dive into, and I know it's a stigma that you can't teach an old dog new tricks, and can you dive into one more time how teaching people to read can still happen into people's adult years and how to combat any stigmas around that?
Oh, yes. You most definitely can teach them. And I have taught several, and that's why I started out with John Corcoran, because John Corcoran had so much shame on not being able to read and having to keep it a secret. I mean, he kept it a secret from everyone. And so once he was able to confront the fact that, there's other people that have this problem, that he wasn't the only person in the whole United States that went through 16 years of school, unable to read. Then he started to confront it, and he cleaned himself up. It did take him 7 years to get to the level he wanted to get to, which was the level of being able to read any book that he wanted to read. Okay, so some people are just satisfied with, now Shayla, what she wanted to get to was she wanted to be able to pass a test. That's why she called up the Learning Center, is she had a job where she was, doing the very hardest work. And in order to get the next level up in the job and make a bit more money and a little easier work, she had to take a test. And she could do the work required at that level, but she couldn't read the test. So that was her goal. And we reached that in just weeks, and this is a young woman who had all kinds of barriers to get over. She had children to take care of and car that didn't work very well, but she made it into her lessons, and she learned fast. And when she called me up at Christmas and told me that she had read the word ornaments, she had to call me up to tell me, I just read the word ornaments. I never thought I could do such a thing. And got to teach them that words have syllables and they can divide words into syllables. And you got the big words, they're nothing but syllables that you can sound out. So sounding out, actually many teachers in the classrooms have been taught not to teach children to sound out words, that is old school. Well, we can teach children to sound out words, we can teach adults to sound out words, but it does take some confront. And we'd rather get it to the kids right away so they don't have to go through all that shame and self-blame and thinking that it's their fault. No, generally they don't think that it's the curriculum's fault. They don't have any clue about that. But once they do, and they can progress.
All right, Sharon, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. We have a couple minutes left. If you had to give the audience just one main takeaway from today as we close out the session, what would it be?
Well, there is something that can be done about it. I guess that's the main takeaway. We have millions of functionally illiterate people who have been cheated by our school system, and something can be done about it. And so I would ask anyone who is in that situation to just confront the fact that they weren't taught correctly. Okay, so that's the way it is. And find a tutor who does know how. And you know what, now on internet, there's, online, you can actually get tutored pretty decently and get programs that can help you. And so you can do it from the comfort of your own home and the privacy of your own home. I would encourage others who aren't good readers to maybe be a volunteer. There are literacy programs all over the United States that depend on volunteers. And of course, teachers. The most important ones are the teachers in the classroom, the ones who have the kindergartners, the first graders, second graders. All right, they need to find out how to teach reading. They need to stand up to anybody that tells them otherwise. And let's make it happen. Let's make it go right. Thank you.
Love it. All right, ladies and gentlemen, Sharon Hillestad, definitely make sure to get her book, The Reading War. And once again, thank you so much to our sponsors for helping make this event a reality. Thank you to Haggerty Digital and also to My Favorite Art Place. We definitely wouldn't be able to put on this amazing event without them. So thank you again, Sharon. I'm going to move you to an attendee, and thank you again for coming on today.
Okay, thank you.